Thank you very much for the awesome intro. My name is Tommy Hansel. I'm a PhD student at UH Manoa. I'm here with my advisor, Dr. Noah Lincoln. He advises and runs the tropical or the indigenous cropping systems lab. And in that lab, me and other students and Noah leads projects on different subjects from indigenous crops to soils and even archaeology of these traditional Hawaiian ag systems. And today we're just going to be talking about soils, the formation of Hawaiian soils, and how that all kind of relates to the role of soil in these awesome agriculture systems. So just to start with a little bit of background on our lab, as I mentioned, we are the Indigenous Cropping Systems Lab. And through this multidisciplinary approach, looking at cropping science, soil science, and archaeology, we're all kind of coming together in this goal and trying to understand traditional Hawaiian ag systems. And we're trying to answer all sorts of questions from how large were these systems, how much food were they producing, how many people were they feeding, where were these ag systems located spatially on a map, and how much land did they cover, and what types of agriculture were done and where. And unfortunately, a lot of the cultivation methods have been lost to history and time. And going through that archaeological lens, we're starting to understand the decision making and management that went into the cultivation of these ag systems, trying to understand what decision making went into why things were cultivated the way they were, and trying to understand the perspective of the Hawaiians when they were deciding what type of food to grow and where. So when it comes to the soils, though, it's the soils and their fertility, as well as the climate and how much water the climate was providing, that really constrained and decided where and how these different types of agriculture could be done. The Hawaiians didn't have conventional fertilizers or irrigation methods like we did today, so they had to make do with what the land had to offer. And Hawaii had a lot of different landscapes to offer, so they got a whole diversity of different types of agriculture. So here's a little outline for today. I want to briefly give an intro to soils in case some of you are perhaps not too familiar with soils and soil science. Maybe you haven't taken a class in soil science before. And then Noah, I'll give it off to him, and he'll talk a little bit about traditional Hawaiian ag systems and their soils. And then I'll go into my research, which is focused in soil pedology, and I'll get into what that is exactly. And then I'll finish up with the work that we did in Laupahoehoe Tropical Forest last year. So first off, we want to know what is soil, and just physically, it's this mixture of solids, liquids, and gases, which all combine to form this ecosystem for microbes, for plants, for cycling nutrients. It's important in agriculture and our environment. So really, it's just this huge system that's so important for so many different things. And the largest fraction of your soils is going to be the mineral fraction. So soils are forming from rock, and as rock is broken down into smaller and smaller particles, that forms the mineral fraction of your soils. And this breakdown occurs through weathering processes such as water or rain, wind erosion. You also have plants which are going in there with their roots and breaking down the rocks into smaller and smaller chunks, or releasing organic acids that are going to chemically weather that rock. And as they're broken down in the smaller and smaller pieces, your minerals are also transforming over time, going from rock minerals like feldspar, quartz, olivine, which you see in a lot of the lava rock here in Hawaii. And as they're weathered, they become more soil minerals like iron oxides and silicate clay minerals. So you get this huge transformation that builds up the mineral fraction of soils. You also have this solid fraction of organic matter, which is kind of similar to the minerals in that they break down over time through a similar weathering process. So obviously you have dead plant material, which is decomposed and breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. And once it gets into its particulate form, it can either be cycled into the atmosphere as CO2, or it can be stored in the soil. And the soils are a huge reservoir for carbon and organic matter, sequestering them in the soil for long periods of time. And you also have microbes, which a lot of, millions of microbes are calling soils home. They do a lot of things for the plants as well by cycling nutrients and making them available, or decomposing plant material. And what's left in the soil is pore space, which is filled up by water and gases. Depending on the climate, you'll get different amounts of water or different amounts of gas in the soil. And that can also be affected by the mineral fraction and how broken down those soil particles are, which will determine how much pore space and surface area is in your soil. So we can organize soils into these groups of soil orders, which are these groups that organize soils by similarities. And this map here shows the soil groups of Hawaii Island. And you can see that they're just dominated by two major ones. And in purple, you have the andesols, which are these soils forming from this mixture of rock and ash and tephra. So they're these volcanically derived soils, and they aren't very common across the earth. I think they make up maybe like 5% of soils around the world, but they make up a large majority of the soils here in Hawaii, obviously being a volcanic archipelago. But they have such an important role in the storage of carbon. I think they store 20% of all carbon in the soils globally. So despite being 5% of soils in the world, they store 20% of the carbon. So a very important carbon pool are andesol soils. And what they're forming from is, if you see this picture on the left here, is this mixture of rock and tephra. This would be a day one andesol, but give it, say, 5,000 years or so, and you'll get a forest like what we see in the Laupahoehoe Tropical Forest, which is developing on this mixture of volcanic debris. And the really important property of these andesols are their high surface area and low density. So if you've ever held cinder or tephra in your hand, you'll notice how light it is. And that's really due to it having just a lot of gas bubbles in it that gives it that porosity. And that's really important for storing water or retaining nutrients in your soil. In brown there, you have histosols, which is another dominant order of soils here in Hawaii. You find these mostly on the really young soils and in young lava flows, like down in Puna or in Kona. And they're classified in having this really high amount of organic matter in them, mostly due to the fact that those young lava flows haven't had enough time to build up that mineral fraction. So you're just really left with a lot of the organic matter and plant debris. But if we look at an older island such as Kauai, you get a huge diversity of soils. And I want to draw your attention to these red soils on the map, which are your oxasols, which are these highly weathered soils where a lot of that rock has been broken down and the minerals have transformed into iron and aluminum oxides and these silicate clay minerals. And because they've been weathered so much, they develop a lot of acidity. So if you're going through dole plantation on Oahu, you'll notice all those red soils. And they're growing pineapple there because the pineapple is so tolerant to acidity. So soils have an important role in agriculture, obviously, as well as things like ecology and in the environment as well. But in agriculture, they're where the plants grow and where they're getting their food and nutrients and water. So the soils are supplying nutrients to plants in an agricultural sense. As the rocks are broken down, they're releasing nutrients into the soil that plants can then uptake. And those nutrients are also being retained, as well as water being retained if you have a nice porous soil that can suck all that water and keep it in there without it filtering through. And they also provide provide beneficial microbes with a nice habitat that they can live in. And those beneficial microbes in return can make nutrients bioavailable to the plants by fixing them, such as rhizobia and mycorrhizae. And clearly, every single crop is going to have its own requirements from the soil. So some crops require high amounts of nitrogen, high amounts of phosphorus. Some require high amounts of water. You know, like for example, sweet potato requires a high amount of calcium and potassium, whereas and then if you're growing papaya and puna, they do really well on these rock soils, which are these histosols that filter water really well, so that they're not getting those root diseases. So just every single type of agriculture, every single type of crop is going to have some demand from the soil that's unique to that crop or type of agriculture. So it's these soil, when you don't have all these conventional management strategies, then you really have to rely on what the climate and the soil has to offer when deciding what type of agriculture can be performed. And that's what the Hawaiians were such masters at, was understanding the efficiency of the land and applying the type of agriculture to what the land had to offer. And because Hawaii had such diverse climate zones and landscapes, you got this huge diversity of different types of agriculture that came out of that. So I'll pass it off to Noah Lincoln here, my advisor, and he'll just briefly talk about the different types of ag systems and kind of their soils and how that really constrained what type of agriculture could be done.
Sure. Thanks, Tommy, and aloha, everybody. So as Tommy laid out well, you know, here in our islands, we have a tremendously diverse climate and ecology, you know, formed by the amazing gradients of rain and of rainfall and substrate age across our islands. And, you know, these two factors, right, rainfall and age, interact to form a whole range of secondary drivers of ecosystems. So the topography of our landscape, as you can see here, looking at the Kohala Peninsula, with the deeply dissected valleys on the windward side and a smooth, undissected volcanic shield on the leeward side. And again, as Tommy spent a lot of time explaining, they interact to form different levels of soil fertility. And essentially, as our ancestors utilized these landscapes, they developed agricultural forms, different types of agricultural systems that were uniquely adapted to each of the different ecologies of our landscapes. So just looking at one little area, such as Kohala here, you know, in these windward areas are deep river valleys where you had surface water and alluvial soils collecting at the bottom of these valleys. These were the ideal locations to develop our lo'i system, the flooded irrigated systems, largely for kalo. But if you went up on those shield surfaces between the valleys in this really, really wet environment, that rain has leached out a lot of the nutrients. And it's a relatively poor soil on these really wet shield surfaces. And this is an example of a place where you would get more a development of a novel forest system, like a food forest or different forms of agroforestry. On the colluvial slopes of these valleys, as they're eroding, they're exposing fresh rock and rejuvenating that soil. So even though it's really wet, the soils are still quite fertile. And in these areas, our ancestors would develop these intensive colluvial slope developments. As you start to wrap around the leeward side and you get more into a mesic habitat, here you have enough rainfall to be doing agriculture, but not so much rainfall that you're depleting your soils. And in these areas, we get the vast, intensive rain-fed systems, often dominated by sweet potato and sugarcane, yams, crops like that. And even as you got into some of these really marginal habitats, the young flows in these dry areas where you're essentially still unweathered lava rock, we still see, opportunistic and seasonal developments of agriculture that utilize some really unique adaptations to cultivate food in those types of ecosystems. We obviously had our aquacultural systems, which again were really placed in accordance with ecology. These have been less well described in terms of their requirements, but essentially you need, right, a shallow nearshore environment. You need a certain degree of protection from surf and surge. Oftentimes you need some freshwater inputs to help power the nutrient dynamics of these aquaculture systems. And then we had a range of other systems that occurred throughout the landscape, including shifting or swidden agricultural systems, such as the famous Pa Kukui systems of Ka'u and Puna and Hamakua. And you also had some hybrid systems that weren't quite lo'i, but they were irrigated on the volcanic plains. And the location and the distribution and the extent of all of these different forms of agriculture were largely governed by the ecological gradients of our islands. And this is just kind of a very conceptual depiction of that, kind of thinking about the different landscape forms and different ecologies and how those resulted in different applications of agricultural form. And so in particular, this project we're working on now is really looking at the Aina Malo'o, the dryland agriculture. And on these, the intensive rain-fed systems, the vast field systems of Kohala and Kona and Ka'u have been relatively well studied and modeled. But as you can see, there's a number of other agricultural forms that our ancestors used that have not been extremely well characterized yet. Colluvial slopes and terraces have been modeled well, and there's been some good work done on that by Natalie Kurashima and Patrick Kirch and others. But when we look at things like agroforestry, shifting cultivation, swale agriculture, these really haven't been well characterized in terms of where our ancestors were employing these different strategies, even though we know through ethnohistory and other descriptions that they were utilized extensively. And so just going to take a couple slides to quickly demonstrate how soil fertility begins to help us understand the distribution of our traditional ag systems. So this is some work by Peter Batusik looking at the Kohala field system. And on this map, that kind of yellowish banana-shaped outline is roughly the archaeological extent of the leeward Kohala field system. And when they looked at the distribution of that field system across the two different flow series, the Hawi flow and the Pololu flow, this is a brief summary of what they found. When they looked at the lower edge, the Makai edge of these field systems, what they saw is that regardless of the soil fertility, and the soil fertility is what's on the graph, mapped out across rainfall on the x-axis, So when they look at those Mackay boundaries of the field system, they find that regardless of the soil fertility, the cutoff of the field system was occurring at the same rainfall amount. And that basically told them that this was the extent of the field system there was driven by rainfall. As you got below about 750 millimeters of rain a year, it was simply too dry to cultivate crops, and they stopped intensifying these field systems. But when they look at the upper edge of the field system, they found that it occurred at quite a different rainfall level. But when you look at the intersection of soil nutrients, they align really quite well. And this suggested then that our ancestors were stopping to intensify these systems on the Mauka edge, not because of rainfall, but because of the fertility of the soils. And that as you crossed a certain threshold, it simply wasn't worth building out this intensive field infrastructure anymore, because your yields started declining due to the soils. And some of our recent work, you can take those parameters, things like the rainfall, the soil fertility, the temperature gradients, and look at where do those factors intersect and get a pretty good estimation of where our ancestors built these intensive field systems. And these have been verified. We're actually doing some more work using archaeological records to look at the validity of these models. But the bottom line is they're fairly accurate, on the order of about 85% accuracy, which is really quite good for this type of broad landscape scale modeling, especially of a human activity. And so some of the work we've been doing now is to try to get a better handle on other forms of dryland agriculture, and in particularly agroforestry or other types of forest modification. And so not going to go into the details on it, but we've been looking at the distribution of agricultural trees on the landscape. And essentially what we're finding, this is again just showing soil fertility on the y-axis and breaking up our data by some agricultural forms, is that there does appear to be these very strong soil thresholds that define where our ancestors were doing agroforestry and forest modification as well. So the same concept that Peter guys used to understand the distribution of the dryland field systems, we're seeing patterns that suggest we can use these same methods to understand where our ancestors were doing agroforestry. And so that's the crux of this project we're working on now. And Tommy's really driving the soil science side of it, to help understand these thresholds. And then again, we're turning those on their head and adding to the work of Thane Ladefogh and Natalie Kurashima and others that have modeled the wetland systems, the dryland systems, the colluvial slope systems. And to that, we're trying to add in some of these other agricultural forms, such as novel forests, intensive agroforestry, these kind of seasonal or opportunistic cropping forms. But to do that, we really need to understand very well the distribution of the biogeochemistry, of the soil fertility. And again, that's the work that Tommy's really driving forward. And so with that, I think I will step out and turn it back over to Tommy.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. So as you mentioned, my research is really looking at these thresholds in soil fertility. And with this type of research, I'm taking a soil pedology or soil formation direction in trying to understand how fertility exists in Hawaiian soils. So with this idea of soil formation, where you're going from fresh lava rock to the formation of a soil through weathering processes, you can think of it almost as like a soil life cycle where you get a really young soil, which is your baby soil where it's still fresh lava rock. And then you have this awesome soil in the middle where you get to your adult soil where it's highly fertile and productive. And then as your soil gets older and older in its life cycle, it loses nutrients and fertility. So in order to understand these ag systems, I'm using this perspective of weathering and the accumulation of nutrients over a soil's life cycle to try and understand these thresholds and cutoffs where these agriculture systems are occurring. So when Noah talked a little bit about the Kohala field system, which is a dryland field system, and how you're in this sweet spot where you get enough water at one end and you get enough fertility at the other end, but you put the field system higher up where it gets wetter, you start losing nutrients. So you get to this sweet spot of fertility where you just have the perfect conditions for growing in highly fertile soils. And we can think about this sweet spot in a soil's life cycle as well, where you have low fertility in the younger soils because a lot of the nutrients are still trapped within the rock, or these soils are too dry, they aren't weathering the rock enough to release those nutrients. And at the other end of the spectrum, you get these old or wet soils where they've just had too much weathering occur, where your soils are now depleted of nutrients. And then somewhere in the middle, you get this Goldilocks zone where the age is just right and the climate is just right and your soils are the most fertile. So again, the kind of direction I'm taking in trying to understand this is through understanding the weathering processes and trying to understand the stages in a soil's life cycle that they go through, or this pedogenic stage. So when looking at weathering, you have to take into account the 5 soil forming factors. So the first one is climate, and climate's going to have an impact on your soil. Obviously, the more water your soil is getting, the more it's weathering. And in Hawaii, you have huge climate gradients. You can go from really dry to really wet, or from really hot to really cold, all within about an hour drive. And you also have this really awesome time gradient here in Hawaii, where you can go from day-old lava rock at Kilauea all the way to soils that are forming on 5 million-year-old rock substrate out in Kauai. And then you have everything in between. And this is just a geologic map of Hawaii Island. And you can see all the flows have been really well mapped out, and each flow has a date to it, and all that work was done by the USGS. And in the opposite direction, you have the parent material, which is actually really consistent. So it has the lack of a gradient. And when I was talking about andosols, I mentioned how they were forming on this mixture between rock, ash, and tephra in a mixture. And all of that rock material and volcanic material is all derived from the mantle plume of the Hawaiian hotspot. So the parent material is relatively consistent. The topography is also consistent depending on how you're sampling. So you have Hawaii's shield volcanoes, and these soils are forming on these very flat, low sloping surfaces where you get an even effect of the topography on the weathering of your soil. And then finally, you have this biota component. I mentioned that you have plant roots are going in and breaking apart rock or releasing organic acids. And the degree to which this is occurring in Hawaii is relatively consistent because your forests, or your native forests in this case, are dominated by just a few select plant species, namely koa, ohia. There's a lot of hapu'u on this island as well. All of those are going to dominate across the climate gradient, and you're going to get a similar impact of the biota on your weathering processes. So for my research, when I'm trying to identify these pockets of fertility based on the climate and the time, uh, in Hawaii, this may be one of the few places where you can control for the other three factors in biota, topography, and to a degree, you can control for the parent material. And this is what allows for this type of research where you can really focus in on the effects of climate and time on the effects of soil formation. And in order to look at that climate component, I'm sampling on these climosequences. So following a lava flow from really dry to really wet conditions. And mapped here on the purple flow is the flow that I was sampling in the Laupahoehoe forest. So you can see I have one section here in the Makai portion where we were following the road. And then we also hiked through the forest from Mana Road all the way to Shack Camp in that tropical forest. And just some pictures from that sampling trip. We were there last July. This is from the Makai section, which is much more wet. So your samples are very muddy and highly weathered. And then up in the Mauka portion, up by Mana Road, you get really nice koa forest, and a lot of the soils are covered by grass, and they might have a little more nutrients in them. And we also spent some time going way up Mauka from Mana Road, getting those really high, dry end of the spectrum samples. And in order to look at that time component, what we're doing is sampling on a chronosequence. So mapped here, I have all of my different aged lava flows that I sampled. And it's that one 7,000-year-old sample, that one lava flow on Hawaii Island, which is where we were sampling in the Laupahoehoe forest. And so that sampling was just one small piece of this much larger puzzle where we were also sampling all different aged lava flows as well. And lucky for me, I got to go explore on Maui and Molokai, and for a couple of weeks there, I was sampling every day, checking out these really cool forests, and it was a great experience. But what you get from this type of sampling is this chronosequence of climosequences, where you have this matrix data set of climate and age data, where every single soil sample is going to be a snapshot time point in a soil's life cycle. And so you can find soil that's 20,000 years old at a rainfall of 1,000. You can find a soil that's 1,000,000 years old at a rainfall of 1,000 millimeters per year, and you can compare those differences. And then you can also compare over a single age lava flow at different rainfalls as well. And mapped here, I just have a couple of those gradients. I already showed you on the top left there our sampling in the forest, but also we sampled in the Humu'ula section of the forest reserve, so just north of the Laupahoehoe forest. We also spent some time in Ala'a forest and on Molokai as well. And I wanted to share some of the data that we got from that Laupahoehoe gradient specifically. So on the x-axis here, we have our climate gradient, which is represented by water balance. And that's just the difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration. And on the y-axis there, we can look at any sort of soil property. In this case, we're looking at silicon, and we can see how it changes over that climate gradient. So for example, here, in the case of silicon, which is really the backbone of the soil, it starts really high, and then it's depleted as your soil gets more and more water, and it's weathering more and more. And a lot of that silicon is lost up until you get to about 5 to 10% silicon in your soil, where it starts to flatline despite increasing in more and more rainfall. And we also get data for this percent remaining component, where we calculate based off how much silicon is in the rock, and we take the ratio of that compared to how much is in the soil. So early on, when you have no weathering, you're at about 100% silicon, and you can see how it just drops off a cliff to about 20 to 30% as you get to more and more weathering from the water. We can also look at all sorts of elements like calcium, which also goes down over weathering, percent remaining of calcium. We can look at pH, which is a really important soil property, where you're more near neutral pH under drier conditions. And then you may hit some sort of threshold where your pH drops significantly at a certain point on your climate gradient, and then it starts to flatline out at a much lower pH through further weathering. And when looking at fertility, we have different properties for that. Noah was showing earlier base saturation, which is a good fertility indicator. We can also look at things like phosphorus or nitrogen. And in this case, this is looking at resin extractable phosphorus, which is just an indicator for phosphorus that is bioavailable to a plant. And we can see that you get some sort of accumulation of phosphorus going across the climate gradient, and then you get some sort of drop off. So there's some sweet spot point where you've had enough water to extract the phosphorus, but not enough to deplete your soil of the phosphorus. We can look at this for all of our different age lava flows. So this is the lava flow that we sampled in the Humu'ula Forest Reserve, which is 120,000 years old. And we find that it peaks in phosphorus at a lower water balance, so drier conditions. And when doing these types of analyses and making these types of graphs, we're really looking for these thresholds or cutoffs that occur when your soil property is changing abruptly. It may be when your soil depletes in a nutrient rapidly. It may be when it's accumulating, but you have these thresholds where your soil property is changing abruptly. And these thresholds are separating these domains. And one thing I'm trying to do in my research is trying to predict where these domains and where these thresholds are occurring as a function of water balance and how old your soil is. So if we're trying to do our threshold analysis, we can look at our soil property, in this case, which is aluminum or exchangeable aluminum. And we're looking for these points of abrupt change in your soil property that separate these areas of consistency, which are your domains. And in this case, we find a threshold at a water balance of 150 millimeters per year. And it's pretty well known that aluminum becomes exchangeable at a pH of 5.5. So we can look at that pH of 5.5 and see that it intersects my data really well at that same water balance. So the data is confirming itself. And we can do this again for all of our different ages, finding thresholds. In this case, looking at the Humu'ula gradient, we find a water balance of 800 this time. Looking at pH of 5.5, we find that it intersects my data once again at 800 millimeters per year. And if we do this for every single one of our different age climo sequences, we start to see how these thresholds change with time. And we can graph the occurrence of these thresholds. So here on the x-axis, I have the age of the soil, and on the y-axis is the water balance at which the threshold is occurring. And if we plot these thresholds chronologically, starting with our youngest, which was the Laupahoehoe soils, we can start to see the trend in weathering in different pedogenic stages that a soil goes through over its life cycle. So then we have the 7,500-year-old soil, 20,000 years old, going up to 120,000 years old, 300,000 on Maui in the Kula soils, 1.4 million on Molokai, and then 4.1 million years old on Kauai. And that finishes off our age gradient. And what we get is this really interesting trend that may allow us to model where these thresholds are occurring So say we have a soil that's 500,000 years old, we can then estimate what threshold or what water balance that threshold may occur, even though we might not have data from that. So trying to get some sort of equation to model where these thresholds occur. And with this, we'd be able to model it spatially. If we can understand through some sort of empirical equation where these thresholds are occurring, then we can delineate them on a map. This is just a very roughly drawn map that I have here showing these lines, which are these thresholds on a map, and they separate these domains, which are each of these different colors. And each domain has been relatively well documented by previous research by Peter Vitusik and Oliver Chadwick in understanding these areas of stability that a soil has. But what we're interested in, especially, are these areas of fertility in that domain that it exists in, trying to understand that with traditional ag systems and where these thresholds are occurring. So what we want to do now is with my soil spatial model, we can then better understand the distribution and limitations that the soil has on these different types of Hawaiian ag systems. And what we can do now is do some sort of spatial analyses, looking at the overlap of these systems with the soil model and where these domains are existing. So that's kind of the end goal of my research. Right now, I'm still collecting data and trying to delineate the equations that will predict where these thresholds are. But with that, hopefully we'll get to some point where we can really predict where fertility is high and the limitations that the soil had in predicting where ag systems were occurring. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. Mahalo nui loa, especially to the Indigenous Cropping Systems Lab for helping out with all of my research in the lab and in the field, and especially to NOAA for advising me on my project. So with that, we'll take any questions and I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Tommy. There is a question in the chat from Mary. She's asking, could you describe your soil sampling technique for each sample given?
Yeah.
Or taken, sorry.
Sure. It's mostly just with a shovel, but sometimes we use a drill, and we're sampling the top 30 centimeters of the soil. So exclusively looking at that root zone or that top layer of the soil where you're getting most of the nutrient cycling. My future research will also do some pits where I'm trying to look at the mineralogy of the soil, but for the purposes of this project and from an agricultural understanding, we're really looking at that topsoil. So just looking at these 0 to 30 centimeter depth integrated samples.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? You can feel free to put on your cameras and unmute yourself, or you can continue to put them in the chat. I can read them.
Hi, aloha. My name is Ilikai. Also can go by Desmond. How you doing, Olivia? Been a while. I just wanted to ask Dr. Noah Lincoln while he's here. Mahalo, and thank you guys so much for your presentation. It's so important, the work that you